Hello, members. Welcome and good evening. I'm going to keep tonight's introduction short and sweet because, as you can see, I'm actually in the tastings room and I'm just a few meters away from our guest speakers this evening. So thank you all for your patience. We did have a moment of panic a minute ago where Zoom globally went down, which is always good fun. But we got through it. It's back on and we are back live, and I'm ready to introduce Jo and JD for this evening's launch of the trilogy of Warwick Estate 2019 vintage. We've got Tim and Mahesh behind the scenes this evening, so hello to both of them. Please do use the chat to let us know where you are and what you're drinking, and please use the Q&A tonight. We've got some time for questions slotted in, so it would be absolutely amazing if you can pop those questions in as we go, and we will manage them behind the scenes. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers for tonight, and I'm going to allow Jo Locke MW, our buyer for South Africa, to do a more formal introduction. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a really great evening.
Okay, we are just getting around the technology. There we go. Fantastic. Okay, let's just reorganize our screen very slightly. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My role is actually very limited this evening. I just have the great pleasure of being able to welcome JD here to our vintage room in Stevenage. JD's already been working hard for us today, doing some presentations to the staff, tasting the very same wines. So we've had an absolute treat this afternoon. And we were reflecting on the fact that actually this is the first time that we've actually met in person. We've met previously on Zoom, tasting between Stellenbosch and here. Is of Trilogy in front of us. So JD, a huge welcome. I know JD is going to give you a bit of background to Warwick, to where it is, a bit of its history. Many of you will know the wines, even if you don't know the property. So we'll have a bit of an introduction before getting into the wines, and then hopefully there'll be a bit of time for some questions at the end. But yeah, I'm really going to stand back and let JD talk you through it. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Great to be here. Well, hello members. Great to share our wines with you. It's a lot of fun. My first time physically at the Wine Society as well. So a lot of firsts for me today. And great fun to be able to share the new vintage of Trilogy on the day that it's launching.
Exactly.
So 2019. So, and great fun to be able to look at 6 different vintages going back 12 years. I really think that puts a lot of things in perspective and questions that a lot of people have about wine in general, but specifically South African wine. So that's quite fun. We're going to kick off with a very brief presentation about Warwick, where we are, just what it looks like, nothing too technical. So Anna, if you could please ask you to put that on the screen for us, that would be great.
There we go. Perfect.
Great stuff. So we are obviously in South Africa. We are in Stellenbosch, and we are even more so not even just in Stellenbosch. We're a little bit more north of the northern side of Stellenbosch. So we're going to click through. Anna, if you can just go to the one where you can see where we are, and that's the next one. One more. There we go. So, sorry, one back. There we go. Brilliant. So that is Warwick taken from the easterly side, looking into a northwesterly direction. And I'd love to point now, but I don't think you'll be able to know what I mean in any case. But basically, you have Warwick situated on a little hill. That hill is called Klapmutskop. And that is the tail end of the Simonsberg mountain. So we are situated on the foothills of that mountain. So basically, you've got a lot of decomposed granite that have washed down the mountainside over many, many years onto a bed of clay. So you've got quite a fertile soil. And like I said, we're on the northern side of town, so it's the warmer side of Stellenbosch, and therefore we specialize predominantly in Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, which you're going to taste in various formats tonight. And if you look past the back of that,
sorry, that was my fault.
There we go. We're back in. So if you look past the right of that little hill, that is where the Swartland area is, which is a very dry and arid region. So about, as you can see, about 60 kilometers away from that. And then to the left of that picture, you'll find Cape Town. So and very much like I said, the warmer side of town, which is really kind of focusing on Cabernet and Cabernet Franc, and I hope we can share a little bit more about the sense of place, and that you can get the feeling of the place through the wines. So just very briefly, what our vineyard setup looks like. As you can see, even though we specialize predominantly in Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, we also have quite a bit of white grapes in the mix, specifically Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, and Chenin, and then also some Pinotage, which is quite exciting. That Cabernet Franc percentage has grown and will grow actually next year. So going up to about close to the Cabernet Sauvignon percentage of 23%. So very much almost on a 50-50 basis from next year on. The other thing that you can note on there is the average rainfall, which is about 600 mils, which is not a hell of a lot. And you can see we've got 40% of drip irrigation. So we really don't have enough water to fully irrigate. We really just do a supplementary irrigation, generally speaking, 3 times through the year to at flowering, at fruit set, and then just before harvest to make sure that we kind of managing everything to where we want to be. So we're not irrigating to get a big crop or really kind of pump water into the vines. It really is just to keep everything happy and healthy throughout the growing season. Click on to the next slide, please. So there you have the Simonsberg Mountains. So the previous photo was taken from the other side, looking back to where we are now. So there you can see the mountainside. It really is quite a majestic mountain that we farm against. And as you can see, that line of clouds at the back, that is the southeaster blowing out of the southeast towards the northwest, and really cools down the vineyards during the peak of summer, especially when we have quite hot days during February and March. That really is kind of lifeline that we rely on quite heavily.
And on the previous slide where you had the plantings, no, the one before that actually, where you were situating where Warwick is, where Stellenbosch is, and the distance to the ocean. It's something that I think it's hard. It's easy to misunderstand if you visit Stellenbosch, especially if you're there in the warmer months. Frankly, I've just been only last month, and it was pretty warm a lot of the time as well.
Very hot, yes.
But you really do. It's fascinating, these mountains, and there are several of them. They really do kind of funnel the winds through, don't they? So you get that.
Yeah.
You do genuinely get that.
You need
wind coming in
and you
off
need
the ocean.
Yeah. So the ocean would be on the right hand of that picture, from where this picture was taken, about 25 kilometers, to give you a bit of perspective. And going back to where that cloud line is, that is going over, you end up in Elgin, Grabo area. So just to give you, and Franschhoek would be to the left of the mountain, just to give you a lay of the land in terms of some other familiar sites. Then we can click on to the next one, please. So just briefly, you can see there's some people having some fun jumping off the back of a game viewer. So you can come for a wine safari. You can see the big 5, which in our case is Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Pinotage, and Chardonnay. It really is a great way of experiencing the farm, sitting on the back of an open vehicle, and you have a wine tasting up on the hill. It really is a super cool way to see the lay of the land and just experience something a bit different.
Absolutely. And I've been lucky enough to do it a couple of times, actually. The first time I was out there with a colleague some years ago, 2017, I think, or maybe 2018. And it was a pretty chilly, rather blowy day, but you certainly get that feeling as you climb up the slopes, you know, and the inclines of those vineyards. You get a fantastic perspective of that as you climb up, and then of course you get the fantastic view. Almost, it's probably not 360, but
close,
it's not far off.
exactly,
It's the most amazing view out over Stellenbosch and the surrounding vineyards, so you can pick out different areas as well. But yeah, you really get that feeling of how you benefit from the breeze up there, which is it's good to do. If you have the chance and you go to Warwick, which I would thoroughly recommend, then the game drive is well worth it.
All right, next slide, please. So there's a brief snapshot of our portfolio. As you can see, Trilogy sits right at the top, and it very much is our flagship wine and the wine that we are most proud of. The tier below, we have a single variety Cabernet Franc, Chardonnay, and the Cabernet Sauvignon, both all three quite unique expressions. And then the tier below, you have the three Cape Ladies, which is a Cape blend consisting of Pinotage, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, as well as some old vine Chenin Blanc, and then the two Professor Black wines that I'll speak a little bit more in detail about later, Sauvignon Blanc and a Heritage blend, and then the First Ladies at the bottom, which really forms the basis of our business from a lifestyle point of view. And we always jokingly say that these wines form part of your pantry rather than your wine cellar. They should be in your shopping trolley kind of at least once or twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so I'm going to the next one. Our logo, so I'm not sure if you guys will be able to see this because I don't think you have bottles in front of you. But there's a little watermark behind the wording there. Our logo is a wedding cup. It is a fascinating story about Norma Ratcliffe going through Germany in the 1970s, finding this quite a unique. Oh, there we go. Thanks. And so I'm going to try and hold this up to you so you can see what we're talking about. So there you can.
Yeah, excellent.
There you can see the lady. So this bottom part, the skirt, is actually the main cup, and then the top. But I'll tell you a bit more. So the fable goes about the princess falling in love with a silversmith. Obviously the king didn't approve of their marriage, and the daughter went on a hunger strike, locked herself in the castle, and eventually the king decided, okay, I have to do something about this. So he came up with what he thought was an impossible challenge, to create a cup that two people can drink out of at the same time. So the silversmith came up with this concept of the lady skirt being the main cup or chalice, and then the small little one at the top on the swivel, ultimately allowing two people to drink from it at the same time. They do get married in the story or in the fable, and they live happily ever after. And that has since day one, since 1984, been Warwick's logo. Norma has kept that, and it has just become part and parcel of our story. So you get quite a lot of people visiting the tasting room, drinking out of it, getting engaged, getting married there, etc. So it's quite a nice little add-on. So if you do ever make your way down there, I do please try and even if you're not married or not planning to get married or are married, have a sip out of the wedding cup, getting the full experience.
And it's a very beautiful thing.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
a clever design, but it's a very beautiful design as well, as is reflected on the label. So yeah.
Right, so the next slide, please. So there's a picture of Norma when she started out making wine. Very humble beginnings for this. Started out with 6 barrels of Cabernet Sauvignon, which she named Le Femme Bleue, which is obviously French for the blue lady. There was a trademark issue. She wasn't allowed to use that name. So 1984 was Le Femme Bleue, and from 1985 it was changed to the Blue Lady, because she wasn't allowed to use that name. But that's also stuck, and we still 30 odd years later still have a Blue Lady in our portfolio. She was an absolute trailblazer, a woman. She still is. Larger than life character. She's only about this. She's very, very tiny, but an absolute pocket rocket, and an amazing woman, an amazing winemaker. And she was well ahead of her time. And I always say that if she lived today and operated today, she would still have been ahead of her time. Really kind of changing the way the South African wine industry operated. Was the first woman to be inducted into the Cape Winemakers Guild, and was also the first female chairperson for the Cape Winemakers Guild, and really giving a bunch of Afrikaans old men a run for their money. So she was really a wonderful character. And a lot of and the first lady for the wine industry, obviously, without saying that's where the name comes from. She was really kind of the poster child of the wine industry in the late 80s and 90s. And if it wasn't for her.
Sorry to interrupt, but the funny thing was, she didn't do it in any kind of
not at all
political way. It was just, I'm going to have a part of this, you know. She was a dynamo.
She didn't do it for any PR reasons or anything. She just did it for
fantastic. And lots of women in the wine industry will have benefited as a result. But actually, I think the whole industry has benefited as a result, because you've now got the most vibrant collection of winemakers of all shapes and sizes and colours, and which is wonderful to see.
Yeah, and she really was one of the trailblazers. So we have a lot of thanks for that. And we'll go on to the next slide. So there is Professor Malcolm Black. We briefly mentioned him earlier. It's the two wines, Professor Black Sauvignon Blanc and the red blend Pitch Black. So he was a professor in pomology at the University of Stellenbosch, specializing specifically in peaches, and selected an early ripening peach variety. He approached the Ratcliffe family, because they had quite a lot of peach orchards at the time, and asked them if he could commercially plant a block or an orchard to test this theory, to see what this would do. And he had all of these visions of South Africa putting peaches onto the market globally in a time where nobody else was being able to do so. Excuse me. Unfortunately, what happens when you change the ripening is you change the whole physiological time frame of the whole process. Sorry, I've got
okay.
Talking too much.
Have a second trilogy. That's what. Yeah.
Oh, much better. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. So, unfortunately, what he'd done by moving the ripening, he moved the flowering straight into our windy season, which is in the time of year where we are now. So those of you who visited during October, November will know the wind and how it blows. And unfortunately blew away all the flowers. So never had a commercial crop for his peaches. So yes, they did ripen early, but there were just not enough of them. So unfortunately, that experiment was a failure. But thanks to him and his failure, we planted Sauvignon Blanc on that site. So if it wasn't for that failure, we wouldn't have had Sauvignon Blanc at Warwick. Excuse me.
And Sauvignon Blanc, we saw on the wheel, the planting wheel that you showed us earlier, that actually, despite the fact that you are probably best known for your red wines, perhaps with the exception of the White Lady Chardonnay, which is a regular award winner.
Very much.
But the Sauvignon Blanc is such an important wine in South Africa, the home market.
Exactly, it's huge. It's number one selling variety in the South African market. So it really is important. And we've put a little Latin phrase on the back of the Professor Black label that says nihil fructa facit, which means nature does nothing in vain. And it actually is. I mean, we didn't come up with it. It's a common thing. So, and it's actually so nice because we didn't plan this. It just happened to work out that way, and it really plays quite an important role in our business. So,
absolutely,
well, it's quite fun. Where are we? Lost the slides. You can go on to the next one, please, Anna. So that is a quick snapshot of our tasting room, and you can go on to the next one. So we really offer a space where you can come and hang out. The idea is you lounge on the lawn, as you can see there, dog friendly, cat friendly, kid friendly. It really is a space where everybody's welcome, and it is quite a large space, as you said earlier. So even if you don't like dogs, kids, or cats, you can find your space where you can really kind of chill out and spend the day. And it really is designed about lounging on the lawn, having some nice food and drinking a glass of wine. And it's the concept is not trying to turn the table. It really, if you book your spot, you book it for the day. And generally people would pitch up at 11, and they would leave kind of at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, just really lounging out and having a great day. That's our forest courtyard. There we have more kind of private functions. We've had weddings, we've had birthday parties, bachelorettes, etc. Beautiful setting. There's an idea about the offering. So really kind of simple rustic food, but delicious, freshly prepared with a glass of wine. And as you can see, that's very much the relaxed atmosphere. And then just a picture of what the tasting room looks like inside.
I was there only a few weeks ago, and it is a lovely spot. We weren't lounging on the lawn. We were sitting at a table on the terrace doing our tasting, but it's a beautiful spot. But actually it was interesting to see that we could observe that there were people coming there for meetings, you know, 2, 3, 4, 6 people getting together, sitting around a table, maybe only having coffee, maybe having a glass of wine, but yeah, no, it was a really nice.
No, it's a nice space,
a nice spot.
Yeah, brilliant,
lovely spot.
So yeah, very briefly, in a nutshell, I hope you all have a slightly better and clearer idea of Warwick and what we strive for, and I hope you also have tried. I didn't tell you that you were allowed to drink, but obviously you're allowed to taste as and when you please. But we're going to now get to the important part of this, and it really is to taste these wines. We're going to do them in 2 flights, so 3 wines, depending on what you have at home. If you only have 1 glass, that's also fine. But really, kind of in your mind, try and group them into 2 groups. So the first 3 wines, and then the second 3 wines. So quite interesting is the fact that you've got in these 6 wines, you have 3 winemakers present making these wines. So I was only involved in the 2019, so I can't take any credit for some of the lovely creations prior to that. So the first 2 wines were made by Joshua Hubert, who is a great guy and a great character, and who unfortunately had to leave Warwick to take over his own family business after the untimely passing of his father. I don't think that was part of his planning, but turned out pretty well for him. They're making some great wines under their own Caribib label, and they've also created this beautiful custom crush facility where a lot of small young winemakers are making 2-3 barrels of really, really interesting stuff. They've also created a wine bar with an in-house sommelier, doing just incredible tastings and things. So he's really gone on to create quite a cool space, and is doing well for him. A lot of great winemakers are buying fruit from his property and for their own labels. So he's doing really well. And he was responsible for the first 2 wines. And then he was followed on by Nick van Aarde, who managed the 2013 up until 2018 vintage. And I took over from Nick in officially full-time in May 2019, and on consultant basis November 2018. So almost exactly to the day 4 years that I've been involved. Can't believe that's gone that quickly. But yeah, so we have, in essence, we're going to split these, as I said, in 2 groups. So 2010, 2012, and 2014, grouped in one for one reason, that they are all Cabernet Sauvignon based. And the second lot are all Cabernet Franc based. Quite an interesting stylistic shift, and also quite an interesting thing purely on why did we do that? And the reasoning for that is Warwick has got a great history with single variety Cabernet Franc, which has allowed us kind of enough information to make this decision. So quite nice to look at these 3 wines in 2 groups, and I think there's a clear line between them.
And it's interesting, that has probably coincided with a growing interest in Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Franc based blends in South Africa. You know, they've been growing in reputation and notoriety. There still aren't many of them, but there are a few now that are very highly regarded. So I think that's an interesting angle. Goodness knows how that's going to plan out in terms of climate change and what impact that may have. Hopefully it'll be a positive, but we'll have to see. But it's also probably one of the contributing factors for the fact that we have only rarely in the past had the single varietal Cabernet Franc. There isn't much of it that comes into the country. It's distributed mostly through independent wine merchants, probably a bit into the restaurant trade as well, I would imagine. But I know you have a very high demand for the straight Cabernet Franc. That's a pretty consistent award winner too. So it flies out the door. So
yeah, production is dismally low at this point in time. So we're really not making a lot of that wine. And for the basic reason that it is all going into the trilogy. So we made that call to rather focus and put the grapes and the top end stuff into trilogy and grow that product rather than a single variety. But it is really interesting how that single variety demand has grown, not only for us but globally. And the different styles of wine, you definitely get the more Bordeaux-esque examples of the variety, and then the Loire examples, which is almost like it's a completely different grape.
Totally. We were talking earlier about Lucas van Noggenberg. His Cab Franc is completely different.
Yeah. So to put those two next together and made from the same variety is actually quite fascinating. So, but let's get back to these wines. So wine number 1, 2010, is 56% Cabernet Sauvignon, 30% Cabernet Franc, and 14% Merlot. So I think, to me, the other interesting thing about this wine is just where it is in its evolution and in its life. We had a long discussion earlier about drinking windows and when they're published and are they correct and are they too conservative, etc. And here you've got a great example. This is also what to me is fascinating, is that this wine has effectively been decanted 12 years after bottling into a little pouch shipped around the country, and it is still fresh. It is still vibrant. It is still full of life. I'm hoping everybody else is agreeing with me.
Very much so. But we tasted the same wine from bottle earlier this afternoon,
and this from pouch is exactly the same. It's my first time from a pouch.
Were you actually? Were you nervous about that? You know,
a little, like
your wine's going into an unknown receptacle.
Yes, but ultimately, I also know that you guys won't do something if you haven't trialed it.
It had been
tested, and you wouldn't put your faith and your company name on the line. But it's fascinating to think that these things didn't exist a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
and that's
remarkable.
Zoom wine tastings didn't exist pre-COVID.
No.
Here we are. So a lot of cool stuff also gets invented through challenging times. But to the point back to the ageability, I think this wine has got a lot of life left in it. There's a beautiful brightness and acidity and freshness, and at 12 years old. So I think we can really, with confidence, say that not only Warwick wines but South African wines do age extremely well. And back to the point is find your own preference. Find where you like primary fruit fading over into more savory and tertiary and secondary flavors.
Absolutely. No, I was saying to JD earlier that we would always tend to be more conservative with drinking windows just to be on the safe side. But certainly some of these wines, these earlier vintages, I would have been conservative with their drink dates. I remember asking Norma what she thought, and she said, 10 years really is the rule here in South Africa, but in your conditions in the UK, especially in a good cellar, potentially plenty more. So initially I gave this wine 10 years, but it's got plenty of life left in it, in my view. I think it's still showing really, really well. It's got some of those tertiary characters already coming through, which I find fascinating. We're obviously going to get some younger fruit as we go through the lineup. But yeah, I love that, and the tannins are very fine. The wine isn't drying out. It's got time in hand, which is good to see.
What's to me quite fascinating is normally you taste your wines from the oldest to the youngest, because you're scared that the young fruit is going to overshadow the oldest wine. And I think you could have done this lineup kind of either or, kind of, and because the wines are all individually standing up to what they are, which I think is quite exciting. Very, very happy with where this is at. There's a lovely kind of cassis and a little bit of herbal character on there at the moment. That's and the tannin to me is really in a happy space, finding quite a nice balance.
You mentioned earlier that 2010 was probably a bit unfairly overshadowed by 2009. 2009 was one of those great vintages, which was good for whites, good for reds. Everyone was just so excited about it, and it proved to be a really super vintage. But then 2010 comes along. It wasn't 2009, so it's always going to be.
And you're not going to have two great vintages in a row. You can't. So unless you bought that off. And jokes. And exactly. So I think had this wine or this vintage been at any other point during its life, it would have been very highly regarded. I think it really is a good buy in the sense that if you find a 2010 from a good producer, you know it's going to be a good wine, and it didn't get all of the hype that 2019, 2015 and 2017 got. So, and had it been at another spot, it probably would have.
And I'd be interested to get your view. In my mind, one shouldn't make comparisons with Europe, but I can't help doing so. To me, 2009, when I try and think back to it in South Africa, the wines were a bit richer, a bit more generous, a bit sweeter fruit. Yeah. This wine is a bit more classical in style. Exactly. Personally, I love that. Yeah. I really like that structure, the freshness that there is, nice bit of tannin grip, but not too much. So it's horses for courses. Some people love the opulence of 2009, and it was certainly an impressive vintage.
I also think to a large extent the industry evolved and grew up within the 2000s. It was 2001 probably up to 2007. South Africa was in a highly demanded space. It was making opulent wines. The industry was doing well. They were using a lot of new oak, picking really ripe, close to 15%. And then, as with anything, the pendulum swings one way and then comes back the other way. It never stops in the middle. Probably gone too far to the other side again with very low alcohol wines, no oak, etc. I mean, which is quite fun to drink in summer, etc. But I think 2009 was probably at the height of a lot of new oak, picking really ripe, and now you have a good vintage. And from there on, it started fading out. Guys acting a little bit more restrained, less new oak, picking closer to 14 than 15%, etc., etc. And I think 2010 kind of shows that example of just pulling in the reins a little bit more. You don't have to give everything the full whack and kitchen sink every single time.
Yeah.
So I think it's in a happy space.
I'm just jumping on, guys, to ask a quick question, if that's all right. First of all, we've got a member who's asking you to explain a little bit about what you mean by pencil shavings and tertiary. So they're two things that you've talked about. So what is a pencil shaving flavour? And then also what's this term tertiary that you're using?
Well, you're the MW, so you can do the pencil shaving one.
Well, pencil shavings is literally if you take an old-fashioned pencil and sharpen it, you get that smell. It's a combination of the wood from the pencil and also the pencil lead. So sometimes people talk about pencil shavings, sometimes pencil lead. And so there is something about particularly that fresh
oak,
the fresh cut smell that you get that is reminiscent of that, and I'm sure it's something that comes from, well, probably some of it comes from the grape or grapes, some of it probably comes from the oak, but that's really what you're referring to on that one. And then tertiary is well, there's a series, isn't there? There's primary, which is the first initial more fruit-driven aromas and flavors, and then you get to secondary, which is the middle phase, and then tertiary is then, to me, if you get to tertiary phase, one of the comments I wrote down in my notes was prayer book. I don't know if that means anything to anybody, but if you think about an old-fashioned, sometimes some of those, so you've left any association with very fresh fruit behind, and you're getting into some of those more complex developed flavors that come naturally with bottle maturity.
Yes, so I always say that primary is very, very fruit driven, as you said now. So very clean cherries, raspberries, blueberries, etc. And then the tertiary, to me, are more savory characters. They go leathery, Marmite is a kind of character I think that I pick up on a lot on wines, but they become meaty, they become savory, and they lose a kind of florally fruit sweet element, and they become more into a savory spectrum. And that really, whether you like it or not, is up to you. And some people like only fruit-driven wines, and they don't like to age them, and others like the other way around. So,
and actually, sometimes we learn to like the secondary and tertiary flavors with experience.
Yeah.
You know, if you give a fully mature wine that's very much at that, you know, towards those latter stages of its maturity, if you give that to a young person, if I give that to my daughter, it's not her thing at all. You know, she's not going to get on with that. On the reverse, as we get older, you know, I'm finding that my palate, whilst I love the elegance of those wines, I also really appreciate the fruit. So I'm very happy to drink some of these wines younger now, as my palate changes as I'm getting older. So it is very much horses for courses, but hopefully this span of vintages over quite a number of years will help to show some of the different kind of aroma and flavor characters that you get from, yes, the blends vary a bit, but it's still fundamentally the same palette of grape varieties from the same place.
The same site within a very short kind of distance.
Yeah, so a lot of what you're able to taste here, some of it will be vintage specific, but a lot of it is about the fact that the wine has had longer in bottle to develop. So yeah, keep that in mind as you're tasting through the wines.
Yeah, so on to the 2012 then. On that note is very, very similar in terms of blends. You've got 54% Cabernet Sauvignon here versus 56, and 32% Cabernet Franc versus 30 in the first one, and then the same amount of Merlot. So very much recipe. I hate the word recipe when it comes to winemaking, because it really isn't a recipe, but very much the similar kind of concept and methodology used here. And really here you can, the difference here would be vintage. And 2012 was probably a lesser vintage than 2010, but by no means a bad vintage. Definitely pick up slightly more kind of blackcurranty cassis flavors on this one too. So more of the fruit flavors, and also a little bit more herbal, a minty kind of eucalypt character that I didn't pick up in the 2010. And
I very much like the freshness in this wine.
Definitely fresh.
You know, it's not a dense wine. To me, it's an elegant wine, but yeah, there's a real freshness to it. It's very clean on the palate.
And it seems a little bit less concentrated than the 2010 in terms of its voluptuousness, a little bit lighter, but in a nice way. So yeah, so it's always interesting in essence to look at these two wines, and they are in essence the same. The same kind of methodology has been used, same cellar, similar amount of new oak, and yet they are
same winemaker, as you said.
Same winemaker, and yet they are completely different. And they'll never be the same, because you'll never be able to compare them at this exact, unless you freeze the one to get it. So you'll never be able to compare them with apples completely. But it is quite fun that wine allows you that kind of play on vintage. It's not like whiskey or beer where things taste the same. And that, I think, is really what makes wine so fascinating, because you'll never really understand anything. Because if you happen to make your way tasting through the world, by the time you're done, you'll have to make your way through quite a lot of other vintages.
Absolutely. So 2014.
2014.
2 years on.
2 years on was quite a challenging vintage, in the sense that 2013 had a very, very wet end of our spring and summer. So leading up to that vintage had a lot of rain, and specifically during flowering and during fruit set. So what that did, lots of bunches, and then also big berries. Lots of cell division took place during fruit set, because there was a lot of water available. So suddenly you're sitting with big berries, and what happens with that is immediately you get a dilution effect. When you're buying table grapes at the supermarket, you're buying these lovely plump big ones, and you want the crunch and you want the kind of juiciness. Wine grapes, we want to be as small as a pea. We really want, because the flavors in the skin. So you don't want the juicy bit of it.
Mhm.
And obviously in a wet vintage or in a wet lead up to the vintages, you're going to get big grapes, and that is exactly what happened in 2014. And you can I think you can pick it up in the wine and in the concentration. And I don't mean all of this in a negative way. It really just is, looking back at it now, 8 years on,
Mhm.
you understand. Now that you've zoomed out a little, you can see what's happened, and you get a more freshness into the wine. You get definitely a less dense palate,
Mhm.
and slightly, almost probably on a similar evolution to the 2012 in terms of flavor development, which is also something from a lesser vintages. They don't tend to last quite as well as the strong vintages, but yet not in no way or form falling on its face. And
No.
we are 8 years in here, so definitely a little bit softer, a little bit more more accessible in terms of weight on the wine. Still quite. I think here you can get the feeling of tannin, of younger tannin, a little bit more prickly. Whereas the tannin have really softened and evolved in the 12 and in the 10.
Yeah, it's interesting looking back on my notes when we first bought this wine. I noted that it needed time to blossom. So reading between the lines, I think when I first tasted this wine when it was young, I wasn't too keen. We didn't buy it when it was young.
Yeah.
But actually the wine came round.
Yeah, exactly.
When it was released later, and I think is a very attractive drink. We were talking earlier about if you do compare with Europe, think about this style of wine it's a Bordeaux style wine, and think of those lighter vintages in Bordeaux.
Exactly.
It works in a very similar way, actually. So a bit more accessible at this stage, probably not so long lived, unless you like that as it gets older, presumably it'll be a little bit more fragile than some of the other wines. But I think it's looking.
It's also you don't necessarily have to drink them in their kind of chronological order.
Absolutely,
you can have your 14s before you have the 12s or the 10s, if that's what you like. And that's, again, it's really up to personal preference and where you find your balance in terms of flavor development. But yeah, again, wonderful thing about vintage and wine, same thing.
And the blend again, I don't think you mentioned it.
Sorry,
it's pretty similar again.
Blend is
wasn't it?
very similar. So 57% Cabernet Sauvignon, 27 Cabernet Franc, and 16 Merlot. So very much there or thereabouts, up and down. And so this is going to be quite interesting because we've now had 3 wines very, very much kind of similar carbon copy in terms of their makeup.
Yep.
And now flipping the dice completely into the Cabernet Franc heavy wines on the next lot, which is going to be quite fascinating to see. So everything from 2015 onwards has been Cabernet Franc driven. So and that was a decision made on the back, like I said, of bottling a lot of single variety Cabernet Franc. First vintage of single variety Cabernet Franc was done 1989. It was the first single variety Cabernet Franc bottled in South Africa. Another first thing that Norma did. So it's thanks to that we had 35 years of library stock to look at and taste and see how they evolve and how they develop to ultimately make this cool.
Yep.
And there aren't a lot of Cabernet Franc driven Bordeaux blends in the world, and they're even less in Stellenbosch. So to be able to have a geographical space that allows you to do something like that I think is quite special and it's quite exciting. That doesn't mean that we don't believe in Cabernet Sauvignon. We're really just kind of trying to create something that is true to us and to that space, and to that little hill that I showed you earlier. So starting with 2016. So it's also interesting to mention that from effectively 2014 was the last normal year that we would see for quite a while. not quite knowing what was to come. So 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19 were part of the drought vintages. I mean, between 2017 and 2018, we had that potential day zero in Cape Town where taps would run dry. It was really a proper disaster. And as I said, in 2016, we had no idea of where we're heading. So 16 and 18 are probably the two vintages worst hit in the drought. And I mean that also not in such a negative way, just really just small crops and concentrated, really taking that wine and going click, 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 click. It's really concentrated. It's almost like you've reduced the wine. And I think the 18 shows that quite well. But yeah, so here we in 2016, we have 51% Cabernet Franc, 34% Cabernet Sauvignon, and then 14% Merlot. So basically, the 2010 and 2012, we take the Cabernet Sauvignon and the Cabernet Franc, and we've just flipped those two varieties. So immediately, I think stylistically, I think it's still quite similar. I think you can still taste Warwick, you can still taste Trilogy, but it does add a more floral element to me to the nose. It adds a more kind of lift to the wine. But the big difference to me is on the palate, is the tannin structure specifically, is a finer grain tannin, whereas Cabernet Sauvignon tends to have quite a chunky, big tannin. I find the Cabernet Franc has got a more kind of smaller tannins, if that makes sense.
To me, there's a lovely silkiness to this wine, I have to say as well. Yes, there is some tannin grip there, but it's a
kind of layered.
Yeah, it's a lovely fine grainy tannin layer. But yeah, there is a lovely silky texture. Some of you listening may know that I'm a big Cabernet Franc fan anyway, so it's a grape that I love. But you know, this works very well. And yes, if it was the first of the more challenging, you know, when the drought really set in, that must have been quite challenging from a winemaking point of view, because you know the vintage circumstances are more extreme. You know, you needed to be sensitive in terms of how you're handling that fruit. And I know it wasn't you that made this wine, but you know,
no, but exactly, you're in a similar boat. So we don't have a lot of tools in winemaking. You've got effectively one ingredient. You have grapes, and you can't do much while it's on the vineyard. The only thing we can do in South Africa, which you can't do in most of Europe, is irrigate. And in a drought year, when you don't physically have water in the dam, there's nothing to irrigate with. So then you're really kind of limiting how you can manage the fruit on the vine. And so February for us, we always have heat waves, and some years you have them in January, and some years you have them in March. In 2016, we had our first heat wave between Christmas and New Year. So grapes haven't gone through veraison, they're still rock hard and green. And now you're already putting a lot of sunlight onto those berries. And normally you would go, okay, cool, you would kind of buffer this with a lot of water, or some water at least, and make sure that the grapes are fine. And you just didn't have any. So a lot of stuff just got completely sunburnt, which was fruit was dropped onto the ground kind of the week after, first week of January. So really kind of dismal crop levels in these vintages. But like I said, because you've got these smaller yields, you can really get that concentration and that richness and fullness into the wines.
Now I have a couple of Cabernet Franc based questions, if that's all right. Apologies for speaking up. I'm speaking into their microphone, but hopefully you can hear me, members. So I have a couple of questions. The first is actually, are there any sacrifices, JD, that you think have occurred with the move away from Sauvignon? So is there anything that you feel that's missing because the Cabernet Sauvignon is less? So reframing the question. And then the second question is from John Kavanagh, which is there any changes in the aging potential with the Cabernet Franc based wines compared to Cabernet Sauvignon ones?
So starting with the first question, I don't believe we're sacrificing anything. I think we're changing. You're not can't really compare the wines in terms of their weight. They're going to be a little bit lighter because of the Cabernet Franc just doesn't have the kind of same intensity as Cabernet Sauvignon has. But I think with the level of Cabernet Sauvignon in the blends, and I think that is quite evident in the next wine, is if you still have enough Cabernet Sauvignon in the blend, it's not like you've dropped down to 80% Cabernet Franc and 10% Cabernet Sauvignon, 10% Merlot. Then I think you would probably be pushing it too far from a stylistic point of view. But as we're trying to hover in this 45 Cabernet Sauvignon, 50 odd, 55% in that one world, Cabernet Franc, and then with a splash of Merlot in between. And I think if you play in that world, there's enough kind of gravitas from the Cabernet Sauvignon to back up the wine so that you're not sacrificing anything. And then the kind of florally lift element that the Cabernet Franc adds to the product, in my opinion, kind of more positive than the lacks of Cabernet Sauvignon would be a negative. And then the second question was
Longevity.
aging. To be 100% honest, I can't tell you much more than 2015, which was the first vintage of Trilogy, but I can tell you about single variety Cabernet Franc and how those have aged. And if it wasn't for that, and having down to 1989, we wouldn't have made the call. And I think that is really the benefit of having that library and going back and tasting all of those vintages. We had the 1997 at an event at a hotel group. It was their 25-year anniversary, and they asked us to sponsor some wines that were on the original wine list, and the Cabernet Franc and the Blue Lady was on it. And those wines, they are super fresh and they're bright, they're light, and they're very much alive. So I don't think we're sacrificing ageability. And again, to come back to our previous statement, we wouldn't have made this call if it wasn't for that. And I think that's why a lot of people haven't done that in South Africa, because there is just not enough history in Cabernet Franc and as single varieties.
I mean, I would only add that, as JD said, there aren't that many examples around the world, let alone in South Africa, of something that's Cabernet Franc led. But if you think of Right Bank Bordeaux, where you will get a significant proportion of Cabernet Franc, it might not be as high as this. In some cases, it may be a bit higher. Some of the very top names are higher. But they haven't failed to deliver in terms of ageability. And actually, funnily enough, I'm thinking of I was chatting recently with somebody who asked me, okay, what my desert island wines would be. And I can't remember how many we were given, 3 or 4, I think we were asked to choose. And Vieux Château Certain in Bordeaux, for a whole host of reasons I won't go into now, would be one of my choices. And not only is that a wine that ages very well, but it's a wine whose lesser vintages, if it's fair to call them lesser vintages, they also age astonishingly well. And if I couple that experience that I was lucky to have in the time I was buying Bordeaux with examples I've had in the Loire, where Cabernet Franc can age incredibly well, albeit less consistent vintage-wise. So it's the best vintages that age very well. But I've been lucky enough to try some very mature examples of Cab Franc from the Loire, and they've been lovely. In a lighter, more delicate style, exactly as you say, they don't have the structure of Cabernet Sauvignon, but that doesn't mean that they're not absolutely beautiful, mature wines. And so it's surprising, if you're a Pinot Noir drinker, just think about it. Pinot Noir can age absolutely beautifully, but it isn't a big wine. So I think,
that's a good example.
I think the jury is out,
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully we'll be allowed to see some of those wines as they're a bit more mature. But I think there's every chance that they will mature absolutely beautifully, just differently,
Yeah, exactly. And the 2015, which is the first vintage we made, we had a couple of weeks ago. That wine tastes like the 2019 one. It is absolutely youthful and bright, and that is not going to go anywhere in the next 10 years. So
one of the things I commented to JD earlier, actually, through all of these wines, is the wonderful color on the wines. And and in a very unforced way, you know, but it's wonderful to see a mature wine that has still got that amount of
vibrancy.
vigor. Yeah, absolutely. Just to the eyes.
Yeah, visually.
Okay, we should move on to the next one.
2018. So this was the other one I said vintage wise that was heavily affected by the drought. And I think here you can get the concentration, probably the heaviest in terms of density out of all of them. And that shows again lesser vintage, but showing absolutely beautiful at this point in time. So blend wise, probably the anomaly of the lot. It's 55% Cabernet Sauvignon, sorry, Cabernet Franc, and 42% Cabernet Sauvignon, and only 3% Merlot. So where you've seen we're constantly kind of hovering around this 14 to 16% Merlot. Merlot does not like water stress and it does not like heat stress. And in this vintage, the Merlot just went absolutely jammy, porty and flabby, and it just went too far. So the bulk of it, there was one little lot that was picked early enough to retain a bit of freshness and life. So hence the 3%. And it's quite interesting how you compare these other wines. It's immediately more kind of structured and dense. So to what extent is that only the vintage 2018 that was dry and it is heavy, or to what extent is the Merlot bringing down the other wines? I don't know. So it's quite fascinating to
the role of Merlot, especially the kind of volumes that have tended to be the norm here. It's a proportion that brings a bit of palate, mid palate, some fleshiness, that fuller fruit in the mid palate. So the fact that there's a lot less Merlot here, that probably is going to contribute to that structured feel to this wine.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure if I tasted this wine, I wouldn't guess that it was Cabernet Franc led. I probably would think that it was Cabernet Sauvignon led because of the structure.
Because of the weight, exactly. And so again, example of how I don't think we're sacrificing anything here in terms of the Cabernet Franc and the weight of the wine. But dense, lots of cassis and dark fruit and kind of blueberry, black and purple, and if you have to couple a color to this wine, and but tannin wise, it's just really kind of full and rich, and I think quite an exciting wine. And again, at 4 years, this is young, it's vibrant. This is gonna last for quite happily another few years.
I think it's also a very relevant reminder of the fact that each vintage is different. Vintages are maybe less extreme in South Africa than in Europe, let's say. But funny enough, I was looking at some notes earlier for Meerlust's Rubicon 2018, and that was a very different blend. It was a step away from their normal blend, and it was absolutely vintage driven. And I think if what you're about is putting the best wine of the vintage in that bottle, you're putting together a blend that represents the property combined with the vintage. It has to be at a level.
But therefore you can't have a fixed formula.
No.
Because it just unfortunately doesn't work then.
No. So
you're going to be sacrificing something.
So it's fascinating when the proportions do stay similar, and often they'll be 9 times out of 10 they'll come from the same bit of the vineyard, the same blocks, but actually what I always find fascinating is talking to winemakers is that you taste effectively with a blank sheet of paper. You're looking for the right elements. And sometimes they will turn out to be, it's that block's come through again, and sometimes it doesn't for whatever reason. But you can't shoehorn them in. It's a matter of. And you should also do your sacrifice,
And you should also not be too quick to judge, because we had a discussion earlier about weak vintages have gone on to blossom just a little bit later in their lives because they're different to the norm. Just it's like having kids. Some of them are very outgoing, some are a little bit shy, some takes a bit of time. So it really, you've got to give everybody and every vintage credit for what they are, and kind of see where you come out.
I probably told the story before, but at least to some members, but there was a wonderful property that we used to visit regularly, well, still, my colleagues still do, but when I was buying Bordeaux, and there was one time that we were there tasting, and the winemaker said, there will be Cabernet Franc in the blend, but there isn't any in the wine I'm showing you now, because it's just not working. So we went into the cellar, we tasted the Cab Franc from barrel, it was wonderful. And he said, I'm really happy with it, but there are times, you know, at this early stage, there are times when you try and put the wines together, it's just too soon, it's just not working. So I'm not showing you that because you'll think I've gone mad. It'll be there. Yeah. And that to me is fascinating as well, that sometimes you've got elements that, so I guess that's a matter of choosing the right time to do your blend, when it's right for your conditions, your vineyards.
And I think that's the key, is that one can't blend just on one day.
Okay.
You can't go and say, okay, cool, we have 6 samples, we're throwing them together now, okay, cool, this is what we got. Because those, we blend effectively over a period of 2 years, but very actively the last 6 months of that, and really refining the selections as we go. And so you have different coopers that you also try and figure out which ones work on which variety, time of aging, etc., etc. But it really, you kind of work your way through that, and then you're absolutely right where you go, like, why this blend worked last year, this is why this, but as soon as I put this in, the Merlot, it doesn't work. I've seen take the Merlot out, oh, wonderful. And then you look at it again in 3 months' time, and the Merlot softened, or the Cabernet softened, and it's gone a little bit dry, and now you're adding the Merlot, and it adds life to it. Wow, okay, wait, yeah, we're back on track. So you have to look at it over a long period of time, and kind of try and look into that crystal ball of what will all of these things look like together in 10 years' time, which is obviously nobody knows. Trying to make an educated guess.
It's why I'm just, you know, so full of admiration for what you do, because that skill of blending, you know, even the same grape from different sites, let alone different grapes from multiple sites, it's fascinating. It really is fascinating.
Yeah, really fun.
Yeah. And we're lucky enough to get results down the line.
We get the easy bit. So just before we move on to the 2019 and discuss that vintage and obviously the EP launch, I want to give members a bit of a warning. The notes, if you did buy the packs, the notes for the 2019 show completely the wrong drink date, and I apologise. Just ignore those notes completely. It is drinking till 2030. So please ignore those, and I am going to send you an updated link to the Primeur offer, as well as the note that Jo has alongside the drink window. So I apologise for that, members, but certainly not only drinking for another year. It's got much longer than that. So I'll hand back over.
You're going to have to, there's not a lot left of this year, so you're going to have to make some haste. Yeah, so 2019, very exciting to be here on the launch of the Primeur, so it's quite fun. As I mentioned earlier, it was the first vintage I was involved in, and really, in essence, a baptism of fire. The end of the drought was in 2019. It started to rain in 2019. Unfortunately, started to rain in the middle of the harvest, which wasn't ideal, and it's something that we don't necessarily deal with in South Africa. It's quite a common occurrence in Bordeaux to have a lot of rain the day before you pick. Not for us, we weren't quite used to this. So the earlier varieties, Merlot specifically, and the younger blocks of Cabernet Franc were in the cellar quite happily. The Cabernet Sauvignon and the later blocks of Cabernet Franc got quite a lot of rain. So we had to change our kind of philosophy a little bit in terms of how we handle the grapes in the cellar, and then also the barrel regime. Funny enough, we ended up kind of going back to a similar blend to without kind of really a preconceived idea. So 48% Cabernet Franc, 38% Cabernet Sauvignon, and for 14% Merlot. But really quite interesting in terms of vintage, where suddenly we have rain and we have to pick earlier, we have to pick later, we have to pick stuff that we're not quite used to. And a little bit less concentration in terms of time on skin, really, because there wasn't that level of density in the wine, and specifically the Cabernet Sauvignons, and then therefore also dropped the oak percentage down to 34%, whereas everything else has been hovering around 50 to 60 in that realm. And
that would be because there would be a risk of the oak dominating too much, drying out the fruit. Okay,
yeah, so we really just thought we were going to dry out the fruit and end up with too much oak tannin, because there wasn't enough grape tannin to kind of balance those two out and form a happy blend. And yeah, I have to say I'm super happy with where we ended up on the wine. It is a bit of an anomaly in terms of stylistics for Trilogy, which wasn't the plan. I was very much first vintage. We're going to keep this safe. We're going to continue in terms of what we're planning and what has been done in the past from a flavor kind of spectrum and stylistic point of view. Mother Nature said, no, thanks, we'll do this. I think here you can really see the brightness of the vintage. There's a higher acidity than we've had in the previous vintages. Obviously, during drought, sunlight degrades malic acid, which is the first thing that happens. So you just drop acidity continuously through your hot spells. So obviously the warmer vintages got lower acidity. So here we had a cooler vintage, higher natural acidities, which gives the wine freshness. It gives it brightness. You've got a lot of red fruit in here. There's a lot of more primary character. I think hopefully to the members can now understand the primary kind of flavor spectrum that we're referring to. And yeah, there's definitely more red fruit than purple and black fruit, if you again had to put a color to it. And the Cabernet Franc tannin to me comes to the fore here quite nicely. That fine kind of structured tannin, which I think adds a lot of finesse to the wine. And but yeah, the brightness, I think, is to me what's really exciting about this one. It's really kind of got a lot of verve and a lot of life in it. And I think what's quite clear about this is that you shouldn't be drinking the 2019 in 2022 or 2023. You can see how these wines are developing and aging, and through the weak vintages, the strong vintages, how you get that kind of voluptuousness and tannin structure evolve over time and over time in the bottle. And I think that's quite exciting, is to taste them young and experience them young and get the fruits and the elements and kind of look at them every year or 18 months or however often you please, and to track that evolution. I think is quite fun.
And apart from anything else, it's a way of, if you're lucky enough to have a case of a wine, it's a wonderful way of, if you try one every few years, you'll get to a stage where you think, actually, I could wait, but to me this is so delicious now.
This is
good.
Exactly.
We were talking earlier about how difficult it is to put a specific drinking date, even a drinking window. It's always an estimation, our best estimation. But the exact timing is down to you. It's down to each individual, isn't it? And what stage you're at in your kind of wine drinking life. So yeah, I don't mind a bit of grit, but then that's partly because we're a household of meat eaters. Maybe if we weren't, we wouldn't like so much tannin in our wines. So I think there are so many different factors come into play. And if you're lucky enough to be able to have more than one bottle of something, then that's when you can experiment.
And the fun thing about that is the only way to get better is to drink more wine.
But actually, I was asking you earlier, wasn't I, about coming in as a new cellar master for a very established brand with a particularly well-established name in Trilogy. You've been lucky enough to benefit from the fact that the Ratcliffes did actually keep back a certain amount of stock, even from relatively early years, and I believe you're still doing that now.
We're still doing that.
You have a re-release program, so you release wines, certain amount of wine later.
Exactly, yeah. But really, the library is key for us to look. We can go back to 1986, the first vintage of Trilogy, and in some cases half bottles of trilogy of 80s and 90s, and really interesting to see how they evolved. And like we said earlier about the small amount of Merlot in the 2018, what in 10 years' time, is that still going to be the right call? And if you're only looking at what you're doing today, you don't have that reference point. But as soon as you can go back to 1987 was a similar vintage to 2019. You can see how they changed. What was the kind of, and Norma still, I can pick up the phone and ask Norma, say, Norma, what happened here? Why is this? Why did you put so little Merlot in the blend, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And that really is fascinating to see, and to watch that evolution. And you can also see the evolution of not only Warwick but also the wine industry, and how alcohols rose through the 80s and the 90s, the amount of new oak went, and how they're slowly coming down again. And you really can do kind of one wine from 1987, one from early 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, late 2000s, and 2050. And you can really track how the industry grows and evolves. And it's quite a fascinating thing to do. And that is really, if it wasn't for that history and that level of detail applied from a long time ago, we wouldn't have been able to do what we do today. So that makes my job a little bit easier, and a lot more exciting.
Absolutely, I'm sure.
Well, thank you both so much. So on that note, we were actually going to have a vote, but Zoom, in its last cruel twist of fate this evening, after teasing us earlier with blacking out for half an hour, it won't let us launch the poll because we've actually overrun. I'm sure you won't mind, members. I'm much happy to have overrun by 11 minutes than I am to do the poll. But I will ask you in the follow-up email which your favourite wine was, because we're interested here at the Wine Society as well. So just before I hand over to do a thanks, to let members know, the 2019 on Primeur offer launched today. Then the 5 back vintages, not including the 2010, the 5 back vintages that we've held on site are also going live overnight. You will receive an email about those, so please don't worry, and you will be able to use the tastings discount on those wines. So it will be 10% off, which is fabulous if you purchase the pack. If you didn't purchase the pack, unfortunately, the tasting discount doesn't apply, but the wines are all still available to you. Other than that, it goes without saying that I'm absolutely delighted to have run this evening. It's our first ever event inside the tasting room, which is great. It feels quite surreal to be stood opposite these guys, but it's been amazing to have, post-COVID, us all back together in a room tasting wine. So a brand new experience for me, and hopefully the members enjoyed it too. So I'm going to hand over to Jo, but Jo, thank you, and Mahesh and Tim behind the scenes, thank you too. And I'm going to hand over to Jo for a proper thanks and goodbye.
Just literally just a last couple of words. Thanks to all of the team who've worked so hard to put this together, and with the help from Warwick supplying some samples for the wine so that we could taste them with some of our own team here as well today. JD, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Pleasure to meet you in person. Hopefully next time we'll be at your place rather than at our place, and hopefully the sun will be shining, which it certainly wasn't here in Stevenage today. No, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking us through the wines. A really great opportunity. Fantastic to have 6 vintages lined up, and as it turned out, with the exception of the last one, the others were just two vintages apart. Really interesting comparison to be able to track those wines over time. And I will certainly look forward, as long as I can, to experiencing these wines over the next few vintages and under your watch.
Thank you so much.
Which will be a pleasure to see. So JD, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jo,
for your time this evening.
From our side, from Warwick to the members for supporting us and have been supporting us for a long time, to Wine Society. I had the privilege of going through this facility today for the first time. I am in awe. It is wonderful. It is really cool to see. And thank you to what you guys do for not only Warwick but the South African industry, to spread our gospel and to share our wines with the world. And thank you guys for the support, and great to be here. And we hope to have you all at Warwick in the near future.
Oh yeah, go if you can. Cheers.
Jo.
Thank you. Good night.
Cheers, Anna.